Dobrý večer, dámy a pánové. Dobrý večer, vážení příznivci filmů Studia Ghibli. Já vás vítám na 65. ročníku Zlín Film Festivalu. A to konkrétně na masterclass, na jedinečné masterclass, která nás zavede do magického světa filmů Studia Ghibli a hlavně do nitra jeho hrdinů, dětských hrdinů a mladých hrdinů. Tuto masterclass pořádáme u příležitosti oslav 40 let od založení Studia Ghibli a projdeme se nejznámějšími filmy, jako je Cesta do fantazie, Princezna Mononoke, Doručovací služba čarodějnice Kiki a princezny a ještě vlastně Totora. Tak. A tuto masterclass povede náš drahý host, je to filmový kritik, kurátor, je to zakladatel podcastu Ghibliotheca a spoluautor několika knih o animaci, mimo jiné anime a Ghibliotheca vyšla i v češtině a dá se koupit i ve Zlíně. Takže teď už jenom přivítám Michaela Leadera z Velké Británie. Hello Michael, could you please join me?
Thank you so much, Jaroslava, and thank you, everyone. I'm wearing a Britney Spears microphone this evening, and I've got space here for some breakdancing if we require that, but hopefully my knees won't be able to do that, so hopefully we won't need to do that. Yes, thank you so much for coming to my masterclass. It sounds very highfalutin. It's a talk, or maybe a lecture, on the theme of youth in the films of Studio Ghibli, taking inspiration from the focus in the film festival this year, an amazing focus on films centered around young people made by Studio Ghibli. That's my line of information there, and my mascot for the evening, May, from My Neighbour Totoro, and one of my favorite scenes in all of cinema, which you'll learn more about in a few short minutes. But I suppose, first of all, Jaroslava did a great job of explaining why I'd be here, because I'm not Japanese and I'm not from Studio Ghibli. But I'm going to reintroduce myself so we're all on the same page. First of all, I should say I'm a film critic, I'm a writer, I'm also a podcaster, and I'm co-creator of a podcast called Ghibliotheque. Actually, maybe we should ask this up front, because it's been a topic of conversation all weekend. Who here says Ghibli? Who here says Ghibli? Okay, it's more Ghiblis than Ghiblis. Okay, so it's an Italian word, Ghibli, that has been transliterated into Japanese, which would be gibberi in Japanese, and I'm now bringing it back into English, Ghibli. Although if you ask the people at the actual studio, they'd say, oh, we should have called it something different if we knew it would cause such trouble for people around the world. And so Ghibliotheque is our own little pun on Ghibli, and also the French word for library, bibliothèque, because the podcast was to be a nice, welcoming space to learn about the films of Studio Ghibli. I started it 7 years ago with my co-host, Jake, who at that time hadn't seen any Studio Ghibli films. And I had been a massive fan for some time, and I said, we need to make a podcast out of this. You can be the newcomer, you can be the Padawan in Jedi terminology, I can be the master, and then we can have a showdown on a lava planet and all that stuff. So what we did with the podcast is we'd go episode by episode, one film by one, introducing Jake to the films of Studio Ghibli, broadening his horizons. And in the end, we thought that was enough of a Mount Everest to climb, 20-odd films in the library of Studio Ghibli. But we got to the end of it, and the great thing is we were able to go out to Japan to visit the Ghibli Museum. That's us on the plane to Japan, recording a podcast episode. We've interviewed filmmakers from Ghibli, and then from then on, we decided to turn Ghibliotheque into a platform to celebrate the wonders of world animation. And we have mini-series looking at filmmakers and studios who, like Studio Ghibli, have a unique worldview and a filmography that really deserves to be watched, film by film, to tell a whole story. And so we've discussed filmmakers such as Cartoon Saloon from Ireland, Henry Selick and Leica Studios from the States, and then Japanese filmmakers like Satoshi Kon and Mamoru Hosoda. And most recently, we did a special mini-series looking at the films of Nick Park at Aardman from the UK. And this is us recording the last episode in the mini-series with our co-host, Steph. And if you look closely, I bought us all gifts for the final episode. If you know your Wallace and Gromit and Feathers McGraw characters, they are vintage salt and pepper shakers that were given away with boxes of tea in the UK back in the 90s that I'd found a box of on eBay. But anyway, you'll learn more about Aardman later in the week from Will Beecher in his masterclass. This isn't a masterclass on Aardman. What else do I do? So I've been very lucky because of this, working in film, that I've hosted screenings of anime and animation around the UK. I've programmed seasons with cinemas, including some of the biggest in the country. This is Jake and I hosting a screening of Tokyo Godfathers, which isn't a Ghibli film, but is one of the great and only Christmas movies to come out of Japan. We showed that at the BFI IMAX, which I think is the biggest cinema in Europe. And we're actually back there in a couple of weeks' time to show Totoro. And then I've been very lucky as well that at a time when Ghibli's films went on Netflix and there was a renewed interest in the films of Studio Ghibli, a publisher got in touch. And Jake and I have written a few books on Ghibli, Japanese animation, and now world animation as well. So here are some pics of me, if you can excuse the narcissism for a second. Me with my book Ghibliotheque, and then The World of Studio Ghibli, which was our book for children, and then Ghibliverse, our most recent book, which ventured beyond the films of Studio Ghibli, because it's my theory and argument that Ghibli's films are fantastic, but they are portals into wider experiences in art and literature, visual history, the landscape of Japan and their own cultural history. And this was our way of making the nerdiest book we were allowed to by our publisher. And since we're here in Zlín, in Czech Republic, I wanted to shout out Marek Černast, which I've just learned is Marek 14. I don't know if that's a pen name or not, but he's the genius translator who translated our anime movie guide into Czech, and I got to meet him last year. Unfortunately, he's over in Prague, which is a bit too far away for this weekend trip to Zlín. Maybe next time I'll get to see him. Okay, so that's a lot of me talking about how great I am. Before all of that stuff, many years ago, I was just a fan, and I looked like this. And you'll get brownie points from me if you can name the band on that T-shirt. Come over and tell me afterwards if you recognize it. Recently, I was rooting around in my parents' attic back in the house I grew up in, and I found a box full of ticket stubs from when I was a teenager. And I found these two, so Spirited Away and Howl's Mo, which is Howl's Moving Castle to you and I. And these were the first two Studio Ghibli films to be released in the UK in a wide theatrical release. And I was there, front row, just the right age, at just the right time to go along on that journey. And now, doing the maths, looking at those ticket stubs, that screening of Howl's Moving Castle was almost 20 years ago, and Spirited Away was nearly 22 years ago. So the bottom line is, I'm old. And it's not easy being old, and that's why I'm not doing any breakdancing in a minute. But how do you stay young as a person who loves and enjoys film? And I think one way to stay young is to watch the films of Studio Ghibli. So let me welcome you once more to my lecture on the films of Studio Ghibli. Now, I should say this is one of many, many, many ways to look at Ghibli's films. They are so rich in themes and different approaches to unpicking them and appreciating them. But since we're here at Zlín and the film festival is focused on children and young people, I think this is a great opportunity to unpack this theme. And when I wrote the blurb for this event for Jaroslava a few months ago, I focused on these bullet points. So before I'd actually written the lecture, and I set myself the task of exploring these bullet points, we're going to talk about how Ghibli's films focus on the lives of young characters, how they respect their fears and anxieties, how they inspire the child within us all, and how they celebrate just how powerful the perspective of youth can be. Now, we should probably get to know each other a bit better. Is there anyone here who's not seen a Studio Ghibli film? Good. You've walked into the wrong room if you hadn't. But it's good to know that we are all at least a little bit aware of who Studio Ghibli is and what they do. But let's have a little introduction to Studio Ghibli. That's a picture I took when I went to Japan in 2019 of the very overgrown and shaded sign outside their HQ. They don't want you to go to their headquarters. I took that picture, and then somebody came out of the front door and said, "Are you lost?" And I said, "No, I'm not lost. I know exactly where I want to be," but we quickly shuffled away. Studio Ghibli was founded in 1985, so 40 years ago this year. That's why we're celebrating their work. And these are the three key players in the Studio Ghibli story. We have, I suppose I'm going from left to right here, we have Hayao Miyazaki, dreamweaver, blockbuster filmmaker, creator of some of the most beloved and highest grossing Japanese films of all time, who had actually worked in animation for 20 years before setting up Studio Ghibli. For many of us, particularly in the UK, we think his career starts in the 1980s, but no, he was a veteran by this point, finally finding his own individual studio for his films. And on the extreme right, we have Isao Takahata, his sort of big brother mentor figure, who's a few years older than him and sadly passed away a few years ago. And when Miyazaki and Takahata started out, Takahata was the director, Miyazaki was the star animator. That was their relationship for the first 10, 15 years that they knew each other. And then they had the opportunity to start this studio together at a time when the trend was for merchandising tie-ins and TV spin-offs and franchises in the 1980s in Japan. They wanted to create a studio that focused on feature films for the big screen. And in the middle there is Toshio Suzuki, who is my favorite character in the story, because he is the main character in all the stories, because he tells the stories. He is the producer and former studio president and self-appointed spokesperson and hype man for the Studio Ghibli story. So that's some of the people we'll be talking about today. Now, when we're talking about Ghibli's films, this is the core canon. Their first film as Studio Ghibli was Castle in the Sky in 1986, and that runs all the way up to The Boy and the Heron, which was released in 2023, 2022. And within that span of nearly 40 years, you have My Neighbour Totoro, Spirited Away, Princess Mononoke, Ponyo, Howl's Moving Castle, so many great films that people around the world have admired. For the purpose of this talk, let's focus on the films that have young characters in major roles. So I'm going to fade out the films that don't have young characters in major roles. Ta-da! So over half their films feature young characters. That's quite a large proportion of the studio's output. And there's even more if you expand the scope and look at peripheral projects. So Miyazaki made a film in 1984 called Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, which is not a Ghibli film, but very much set the stage for Ghibli. It's the success of that movie and some of the key players that were involved in the production that would then go on to form Studio Ghibli. They also do the odd TV series or short film that has young characters, like Ronya the Robber's Daughter, which was a TV streaming series. And as I said, Takahata and Miyazaki had been making work together for over a decade before Ghibli was founded, and these all have young characters as well. There's Panda Go Panda, a pair of short films that they'd made in the early 1970s, and they basically pioneered a new form of almost tea-time children's television that is huge in Japan, still well respected, and actually well respected in Mediterranean countries in Europe as well. Series like Heidi, Girl of the Alps, Anne of Green Gables, Future Boy Conan, which was Miyazaki's first directorial credit on his own. So this is a lot of kids. They focus on youth professionally, don't they, as a studio? And there's a quote here from Miyazaki that I want to share, where he believes that Ghibli is a studio that makes good movies for children to watch. And I don't think that's quite true. For one, their films are enjoyed by people of all ages. I think there are people in this room, you all look like you're over 10, right? But also films of theirs that aren't really for kids as well. Princess Mononoke, which we showed just yesterday here at the festival, has a beheading in the first 5 minutes, and a guy gets his arm chopped off as well. but they also have some more grown-up films as well. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to stick with films directed by Hayao Miyazaki that are for children, which unfortunately means that we miss out on some really great films and some that are screening in the festival as well. So this is my brief sidebar where I say that Grave the Fireflies, Princess Kaguya, and When Marnie Was There, all fantastic films that are also worth digging into. Maybe if we have a Q&A section afterwards, we can talk about this as well. But let's dig into things. So, while I was putting this talk together, I was thinking of the ways that you could categorize or structure Miyazaki's filmography with regard to how these films approach themes related to youth. And I've stolen the title of 2 books of poetry from the English poet William Blake. One is Songs of Innocence. So I think that these are films that Miyazaki's made with young kids aged 5 to 10. They're defined by a sense of childlike wonder, and the themes are curiosity, exploration, and the possibility of magic. And I think my mascot here is Ponyo from the film Ponyo. Another William Blake book of poems, and the opposite of Songs of Innocence, is Songs of Experience. This is the other end of the spectrum. Teenagers who are coming of age, but are inheriting a ruined world and shouldering the responsibility for the future of mankind. And here's Princess Mononoke. Well, it's San from Princess Mononoke, and as you see there, not necessarily a film for kids. Lots of blood in that film. But I'm going to suggest an intermediate category between the two. This isn't a book of William Blake poems. This is, maybe I should write a book of poems with this title. This is Songs of Independence. And these are films about tweens, aged between 10 and 14. These are coming-of-age films, but it's not about inheriting the world. It's just forming their identity and finding their own talents. So I'm going to go through these now. And let's start with, oh yeah, of course, that's Kiki. We're going to come back to Kiki in a minute. But let's start with Songs of Innocence. The 2 films that I put in this bracket, and they're big ones, are My Neighbour Totoro and Ponyo. You may be well aware of what these films are about, but if you've not seen them, My Neighbour Totoro is about 2 girls who move to a new house in the countryside, and they discover forest spirits living under the tree outside their home. And Ponyo is about a magical fish who turns into a girl and forms a deep friendship with a young boy, all while there's a huge storm brewing in this seaside town. And here's a quote from Miyazaki from when he made Ponyo. He says, "What children need these days is ways to enjoy their ordinary days." And what's funny about this quote, of course, is that both these films are fantasy films with magic and monsters and magical creatures. And yet, these magical films make space to highlight little everyday moments that excite the curiosity and imagination of kids in the audience, and probably excite the inner children of the grown-ups in the audience too. And here's a wonderful scene from Ponyo, one that I really love, where it's in the middle of this huge storm, and there's no magic in this scene apart from domestic magic. Lisa, the mum, makes the 2 characters, Sosuke and Ponyo, a feast of instant ramen, egg, and ham. And it's just shot and presented with such magic, and she even has an abracadabra flourish when she opens the lid of the ramen. And the kids respond as if there's just such a magical trick that's been played in front of them. And I've watched this with my son, who's now 6, and there's a moment where he has actually gasped watching this, and it's just basically a bowl of super noodles with an egg in it. And I think that is something that's key to these films. And there are moments like this in other Miyazaki movies as well. These are sensual sequences, the colors, the detail, the sound design, and they have a real tactile, everyday quality. Even though they're animated, they are more real than real. Totoro has that too. The first half of the movie, before Totoro even shows up, you have sequences of Satsuki and Mei, these 2 girls, exploring their new home. And we have scenes of them just simply filling up buckets of water, or using a pump of a well, or picking ripe corn, from the field, and it's so tactile. There's such an attention to detail in the sound design and showing the cause and effect of doing these everyday boring tasks. And here's another quote. Adults must show children that there are good things and there are wonderful ways of experiencing and looking at the world. And I want to focus on that word, looking, because looking is so important to My Neighbour Totoro. I think it's what is so radical and what makes it a masterpiece. Throughout the film, we get these moments where the childlike perspective of May, in particular, is given great importance. And it's almost teaching us, whether we are 5 years old or 50 years old, to look through her eyes. And we see this early on in pairings of shots where she's just looking down at tadpoles in a puddle. Or this brilliant bit, which is where I got the still from at the very beginning, where she picks up a bucket with a hole in the bottom, and it becomes a literal viewfinder that we are then looking through as an audience, as she then sees a shiny acorn. And we're looking through her eyes at her little world. And Miyazaki wrote in the director's proposal for Totoro that he wanted this film to show us what we've forgotten, what we don't notice, and what we are convinced we've lost. And I think May's 5-year-old viewpoint is key to all of that. And here are some more examples. When May first goes up into the dusty, old, scary attic of their new house that's pretty much falling down when they're moving into it, she meets these soot sprite creations. And there's such a wonderful tension in these shots between May's point of view and what we are curious to see. What's there between the cracks in the wall. And kind of like with the ramen in Ponyo, there's such a wonderful cause and effect between these shots, where you go up to the wall, you poke your finger in it, and what's going to happen? A big billowing cloud of dust comes out all over you. Or there's a soot sprite dust bunny landing down there, and you clap your hands around it. This focusing on the single moment of sound and percussion. We also see this sense of tension and suspense when May first meets the little Totoro creatures. She's standing outside her house, and she thinks they've run under the house, when really, when we focus on this shot, they hold this shot for so long, so patiently. Really, they're sneaking around in the background. And you can we're almost like kids ourselves, saying, look behind you, it's behind you. And of course, then she does see them, and what happens? There's this amazing release, and what happens is running. And May runs after them. And children running is such a key theme and motif for Miyazaki. It's something that he cares about deeply. It's what he's nerdy about as a filmmaker. It's something that actually animators at Ghibli worry about having to do. They worry about animating scenes of running because they know Miyazaki will come and check they're working. And they'll correct it. He'll correct it to his high standards. And he has big ideas about running. He says, children aren't conscious of wanting to run. They're only aware of wanting to get somewhere quickly. And in order to go quickly, they naturally end up running. So for May and Satsuki, it's like a mode of expression. Running as a form of delight, of curiosity and excitement. And their bodies are propelled forward, even head over heels in that final shot there, that GIF I've put in here. And there's another similar scene, just an absolutely transcendent scene of running in Ponyo, where she's trying to get back to Sosuke and she's just running on water. And this is the spirit of childhood that Miyazaki admires so much. And he wants to inspire the kids and the adults who watch his films. For Totoro, he said that My Neighbour Totoro aims to be a happy and heartwarming film, a film that lets the audience go home with pleasant, glad feelings. And he wants children to start exploring thickets behind shrines and climbing trees to find a Totoro. He doesn't want you to binge the whole series like I've done many times. He wants you to watch it once and get out and touch some grass. Which might be self-defeating for a filmmaker with a studio to run. But anyway, here's another quote. All we need to do is create a space for children where they can be free so they can recover their original spirits. And if they think the world is interesting, they will become more curious. And what's interesting is he's not talking about a film in this quote. He's actually talking about the Ghibli Museum in Tokyo. Has anyone here been to the Ghibli Museum in Tokyo? It's such a wonderful, fascinating place that brings out a lot of what we've just discussed on screen, but in the real world, in actual physical space. It's designed with children in mind, with a sort of non-linear pathway through the museum, secret kid-height doors that only kids can crawl through, and adults can't get through, of course. And it's also full of stuff, and it's obsessed with the tangible, mechanical, creative processes behind animation. It has these hand-cranked machines you can do to make zoetropes work or show the flicker of a projector. And most importantly for Miyazaki, there are no photographs allowed on site. So you're only allowed to take pictures on the outside or on the roof. So this is us on the roof back in 2019. But he said no photographs inside the museum because he says parents taking photos, that's only satisfying the parents. Kids become more self-conscious or self-aware when the parents are taking photos. And he wants that to be a space for freedom. And freedom is the word as we move on to songs of independence. This is where freedom, and particularly freedom from parents, is a major theme. And these are 3 films I'm going to mention under this category. So this is Kiki's Delivery Service from 1989, Whisper of the Heart, my personal gem favorite Ghibli film, and Spirited Away from 2001, a massive record-breaking blockbuster. Something I'd say about all of them is they are journeys. Kiki's Delivery Service is about a young witch who reaches the age where she must leave her family behind, go and find her own hometown and her own livelihood. And so using her magical powers of flying on her broomstick, she sets up a delivery service for a local bakery in this town she lands in. In Spirited Away, we first meet 10-year-old Chihiro mid-sulk. What I love about this is Miyazaki, when he first described Chihiro to the world in the release day press conference in Japan, he said, she's a brat. And she's moving home. She's being torn away from her friends. And so she's, quite rightly, pretty grumpy. But she's separated from her mum and dad and is left to fend for herself in an enchanted bathhouse filled with gods and monsters. It's dangerous, and she can only survive through feats of intelligence, bravery, and compassion. And then there's Whisper of the Heart, which I've put to the side here because it's not a fantasy movie. It's a slice-of-life drama. And the journey is much more everyday and grounded. And it's about a girl called Shizuku who dreams of being a writer. And it's through her relationship with a young boy called Seiji in their sleepy West Tokyo suburb that she finds her spark. It's a romance as well. So Miyazaki once wrote that Kiki's Delivery Service is about the struggle to become independent. And he said that the first image that came to mind when he was adapting the novel was that he saw Kiki flying high above the town she was going to land in and make her new home. And he thought that even though she has this wonderful magic power to fly, that there is a profound loneliness high above the city. And I think that's something that he thought that young people, especially for Kiki's Delivery Service, they pitched it to young urban professionals, working women, something that all of us could relate to, that we would at some point have to literally fly the nest and set up our own home somewhere else. So with independence comes this sense of isolation, solitude. And these films make space to show these characters in quite quiet, lonely, uncertain moments, as we've all had. And I'm going to put Boy and the Heron in here too, but I think we'll mention this later. Instead, I'd like to focus on Whisper of the Heart for the moment, because this is my lecture and I get to talk about whatever film I want, although it is playing in the festival later in the week, so definitely see it if you're still around by that point. I really love this film. I think it deserves more attention. But I should say that Miyazaki didn't direct it. It was actually Yoshifumi Kondo, his protege, who unfortunately died very young. He directed it, but Miyazaki did write it, and he planned out the storyboards for the film. And I think there's no greater example of how animation can make the everyday humdrum world look so vivid and alive than this film. And I can say that with confidence because I've been to the suburb that it's based in. I dragged Jake and our friends all the way out to the Tama Hills, Seiseki Sekugoka Station in Tokyo. And it's a boring suburb, it really is, but that's the film, that's the magic of cinema. But how does it make it seem so magical and alive? The film infuses Shizuku's surroundings with such magic and serendipity. At the beginning of the film, she jumps on a train one morning and a cat sits next to her. And the cat eventually leads her on this wayward journey through the hills of the suburb to an antique store. And it's there that she meets the owner, this old man, and gets to know his grandson, who I mentioned earlier. And it leads to these two very key scenes. One, when the antique store owner, really Miyazaki talking through this character straight to the kids in the audience. He explains that there's talent within her, but she just must work at it, like a gemstone to excavate it. And there's another, possibly the most wholesome scene in all of animation, where the two kids, one a writer, the other an aspiring violin carver, with the help of some local blokes who happen to be around, jam out a version of this John Denver song, Take Me Home, Country Roads. And this is them coming together, the old generation, the young generation, creating some music or art together. But this shows that these journeys of self-discovery are enabled, even though they're sometimes quite lonely and fraught with doubt and anxiety, they are enabled by other people. There will always be people to help you along, generally older people, bigger brothers, sisters, father figures, mentors. These are the people you'll find when you leave your family behind and you strike out on your own. Some of my favorite characters from all of Ghibli and animation history here, Ursula, the artist in Kiki's Delivery Service, who's living out in the forest and painting all day. What an amazing life. Osono, the baker, as well. I'd like to introduce two more quotes from Miyazaki here about how these films are intended to inspire the audience. He says, I want these children or young people to know that the world is deep and filled with variety. There are infinite possibilities in this world they live in, and that they are part of this world. They are not separate from it. And also, I love this one. The world is rich and precious, and they hold it in their hands, which makes me think of this dream imagination sequence in Whisper of the Heart, where Shizuku discovers her inner spark of imagination. Ultimately, all of these stories of independence end on a happy note. Kiki saves the day and is the toast of the town. Chihiro rescues her parents and makes it across the bridge back to reality. Shizuku and Seiji declare their love for one another as the sun rises over Tokyo, and they also pledge to get married, which I think is a little bit, they're getting a bit ahead of themselves, maybe. But I think this ending point is what distinguishes these films from our final category. So moving from songs of independence to songs of experience, which, as I said, has similar coming-of-age themes, although with slightly older characters, and with an overall bleaker outlook on the world. And here it's less about finding yourself and grasping life with both hands. It's more about coming to terms with the horror and devastation that's happening in the world all around us. So these are the three films I'd say land in this category, and I think you can probably bring in a couple of others as well. It's Nausicaa of the Vow of the Wind, 1984, Princess Mononoke from 1997, and The Boy and the Heron from only a couple of years ago. Although I should say Mahito in Boy and the Heron is actually younger. He's not a teenager, but he carries himself like a teenager. These films aren't as interested in forming identities. They're interested in presenting their young characters with challenges, dilemmas, conflicts, and choices. And whereas the Songs of Independence saw Kiki and Chihiro going out into unfamiliar worlds, here the worlds around these characters, the very world outside their door, is their places of danger and horror and uncertainty. So Naushka is a warrior protecting her home from both imperial and environmental devastation. San and Ashitaka in Princess Mononoke are fighting for balance in a war between humans and gods, with the natural world at stake. And in The Boy and the Heron, Mahito is living at the height of the Second World War, and he's dealing with grief and survivor's guilt. And by the end of all these films, these characters take a stand, often in defiance of the adult world and all the mistakes and greed and stubbornness of the grown-ups. They make a choice about what they believe in and what world they want to live in, what kind of world they want to live in. And I think the Japanese title of The Boy and the Heron explains it perfectly. They changed it for the English language world to The Boy and the Heron, but the Japanese title is How Do You Live? It's a question for those in the audience. What sort of world do you want to create? What do you value? These films confront us, whether we're young or old, with our own complicity in the evils of humanity. They're not always uplifting, they're quite downer films at times. But rather than presenting a solution, an easy out, an easy resolution or solution, it's striving to inspire and speak to the young ones among us. Here's a quote about Princess Mononoke in particular. Princess Mononoke does not purport to solve the problems of the entire world. The battle between rampaging forest gods and humanity cannot end well. Yet, even amongst the hatred and slaughter, it is possible for beautiful things to exist. And again, Miyazaki's films hinge on these small moments of beauty and calm and connection and compassion, of the beauty of nature and hope for the future. And the tagline for Princess Mononoke in Japan is a really simple one, but it's profound. And that was just one word, and it was live. And those who've seen The Wind Rises, which is not necessarily a film about a young person, it follows a man throughout his whole life. And it's about a lost generation of dreamers who happened to come of age just in the shadow of war before the Second World War broke out. In one of the final scenes of the film, one of the very final lines, we have Jiro, our main character, and an apparition of his dead wife, Naoko, and she tells him to live. It's all about living. Sometimes a Miyazaki movie instead ends with the young protagonists taking a stand against the powers that be and wiping the slate clean. And with this one, I'm going to go all the way back to the beginning, to Castle in the Sky. And this is Pazu and Sheeta. And the whole film has been about finding this mystical, mythical island, Laputa, one that holds great value for the power hungry, the technology it has to conquer and subjugate. And they decide, in a key decisive moment, to say a magic word of destruction, Bals. And that causes the entire island, floating island, to collapse around them, and even sends the armies flying through the sky. And it's a better choice, perhaps, than letting the grown-ups have their way. So this is a bit of a downer, really, isn't it? The adult world is broken, it's decaying, it's corrupt, we've ruined it for future generations. However, we put our faith in young people. But I want to be clear here, Miyazaki isn't, he isn't Peter Pan. He does cherish youth, but let me change gear for a second, take a sidetrack, and welcome you to my mini lecture called Never Get Old, Old Age in the Films of Studio Ghibli. This is where another one of Miyazaki's greatest hits can come up, one I've not mentioned so far. It's Howl's Mo, or Howl's Moving Castle. Unlike all the films we've talked about so far, this one is not about youth, it's about old age. And I was thinking about this film while putting this presentation together in the last few weeks, because this guy has been in the news quite a bit. Perhaps a surprise cameo you wouldn't expect to see in this presentation, Tom Cruise. So he has a new film out. I'm not promoting it, but it's Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning, and here he is. He's doing something very responsible, hanging on the outside of an airplane. Don't try this at home. Here he is on top of the BFI IMAX in London, the cinema that here he is. That cinema where I'm going to be showing My Neighbour Totoro in a couple of weeks. I like Tom Cruise. He's a great movie star, but there's something that doesn't sit right with me and bugs me about him, and it's how hollow his appeal is. And I think it's because he refuses to acknowledge his age. And there are other movie stars we can talk about who do the same. He is 62 right now. He's 63 in July, I think. And yet through training and exercise and eating the right food and probably a lot of help from other people, he's managed to stay looking relatively young. He looks and acts and takes on roles like a man 20, 30 years younger than him. And that's Tom Cruise, age 62. This is Miyazaki, age 62-ish. And what was he doing around this age? I did the maths, and he was making Howl's Moving Castle. And this is a film all about aging, the fear of and anxiety of getting old. It's about a young girl cursed to look like an elderly woman. It's about powerful, magical beings who use their great gifts to make themselves look young. It's about vanity and how empty and ultimately self-destructive that impulse can be. There's no substitute for knowing yourself and finding your own sense of self-worth that is separate from what others may think of how you look on the outside. And I think there's something key here. You can't enshrine the spirit of childhood without accepting and celebrating old age. And Miyazaki is the grumpiest old man in the world, isn't he? But we see throughout Miyazaki's movies, there are so many great older characters. They have such vivacity, they're full of life. There's Dola in Castle in the Sky, Kamaji in Spirited Away. It shows that even within old age, there can be youth behind the wrinkles. And I want to make space here for this wonderful procession of old ladies in The Boy and the Heron, who have they're all so distinctive and they're animated so distinctively. They're amazing. And what else did Miyazaki do in his early 60s? He opened the Ghibli Museum, as I mentioned earlier. He also founded a nursery called the Three Bears Nursery, which was a childcare center for Ghibli staff, just around the corner from the studio headquarters. And he'd walk past the nursery every day on the way into the studio, and the kids themselves would visit his office and get to know him. And a few years later, and this is during the making of The Boy and the Heron, he'd look out the window when he's working at his desk, and he'd see this empty lot, which the studio owned and weren't using. And he thought, as you can see in the subtitle there, wouldn't it make a good playing field for local kids? And this is in the documentary Hayao Miyazaki and the Heron. And it becomes a recurring motif. Kids from the nursery will sing him happy birthday every year. He'd preside over their graduation ceremonies and wish them well on their way into elementary school. And then kids would play in this field through the seasons. And so I think there's a direct link here. He's sitting at his desk, literally making these films, drawing inspiration from children at play. So that's infusing the films themselves with youth. Now I'm going to go back to William Blake. I didn't just want to steal the names of his books, although he's been dead for 400 years, so he can't sue me. But this is paying off that reference from earlier. In the Songs of Innocence, there's a poem called Nurse's Song, and there's a stanza in here that I'd like to read out to you. When the voices of children are heard on the green, and laughing is heard on the hill, my heart is at rest within my breast, and everything else is still. And that might as well be describing Hayao Miyazaki and how he works, the feeling that he puts into his films. Even though his films are wonderfully, they're wonderfully constructed, they're multifaceted, they're complex, they're flawed and unique, there is this undercurrent of childhood magic running right through them. And here's a quote to see us off, to wrap things up. For children, there is always hope. Some children may quickly grow into boring adults, but new children will always appear. There are always children. And hopefully we're not boring adults in this room this evening, but to me, that's how the films of Studio Ghibli will always be, forever young. So thank you for listening to my talk. I'll say very quickly, thank you to Simona and the team, thank you to Jaroslava, thank you to Martina and Bara in the booth who've been simultaneously translating my rambly English. All the quotes I've been getting for this evening have been from these 3 books, 2 books of Miyazaki's writings and interviews, directorial memoranda, starting point, turning point, but this book, Mixing Work with Pleasure, My Life at Studio Ghibli by Toshio Suzuki, is really fun. It's where he takes credit for everything and spins all of the yarns that he wants to spin in one handy book. But so, Jiekui, thank you for listening to me, and like Kiki at the end, I'm ready to take any questions or any thoughts that anyone in the room has. Do I need to take the microphone out, or is Jaroslava, are you going to do it for me? Okay. Any hands up? Any thoughts or questions based on what we thought about? I'm going to have a drink of water while you have a think. Oh, there's somebody there.
Okay, hi.
Hi.
Thank you for all the things we've heard today. I was just wondering whether you have children, because I'm not so familiar with your life, and or the children of your friends or families. How young were they when they're starting to watch movies from Studio Ghibli? Do you know?
So my son is 6. He's seen maybe 3 Ghibli films now. He's seen Kiki's Delivery Service, and Totoro, and maybe The Cat Returns. Oh, and Ponyo as well, so maybe 4. I've been very hands-off with him, being a film nerd, and some of my film nerd friends have a whole syllabus for their kids. And I remember years before I became a dad, I remember hearing Martin Scorsese interviewed on the radio in the UK, and he would talk about how of course, he has an amazing archive of films. He had a daughter quite late in life, and she's now 19, 18, she's big on TikTok. But when she was a kid, he would show her Buster Keaton movies. He would show her Fleischer Studios animation. And he said quite proudly that when they would all sit down in the screening room, the kids would say, "Do they talk in this one, Daddy?" And it kind of set almost too high hopes for me, like having a film nerd baby. But I decided to take it easy. He'll be able to discover it in his own time, because I showed him Totoro a little bit too young. Because what we kind of almost forget a little bit about Totoro is he's a big creature with massive teeth. And the first time that May meets him, she lands on his tummy, and there's a perspective shot from inside Totoro's mouth as he's kind of growling / yawning, and you just see her through the teeth, and he thought he was going to eat her, my son. So I've decided to take it slowly, but I have friends of mine who have their kids who have seen many of them, yeah, who are made of much harder stuff. But my son, he's too pure for this world, I think.
Hey, thank you very much.
There's somebody near the front here.
Hi, thank you. It's not so much a question as an observation. Because I was thinking, like the talk you did today, you selected everything, you know, according to your theme and the way you organized it. But I think what's interesting with Miyazaki's films is that I think you could have talked about exactly the same films with so many different angles.
Absolutely.
Like it could have been like war in Miyazaki's film, or artistic struggle, becoming an artist, losing inspiration in Miyazaki's film, or, you know, breaking free. You know, there's so many
yeah.
ways of talking about these films, and I'm thinking about it because often in the industry, when you're presenting, you're pitching, you want to attach a sales agent or a distributor, especially the national distributors, is always like, oh, a film can only be about one thing. And that's often, you know, we sort of, you feel like you need to present it in a simple way, and if it's too complex, and if you have an audience that is not clearly defined, it's always like a problem. And I think that's so interesting in the way they have been able to make like these super complex films and sort of proven themselves at the box office as well. I think it's super inspiring, and I think it has opened also new ways of thinking about films and making films, and hopefully also I think is currently inspiring a lot of things that goes on in Western Europe as well, not so much in the US at the moment. But
well, no, but you talk to any animator working at any major studio in the US and they love Ghibli. I mean, they wish they could make films like that.
Yeah, but they could. But they, yeah, we'll, you know.
Yeah, no, exactly. And this is why I'm asked all the time, who's the next Miyazaki? And I just don't think there is going to be another one, because the circumstances were so perfect and unique for him. He had this freedom to make films. He didn't have to go through the multiple, you know, in the way that when we watch animated films and we have to sit through 30 seconds of idents because you have to cobble together all these film funds, and some of the greatest work have to really beg and borrow and steal to make their budgets. Miyazaki was given the freedom, and Takahata as well, who I didn't really touch on here. His films were much more radical, much more iconoclastic than Miyazaki's. Miyazaki's was the popcorn movie compared to him. But Miyazaki was able to really, the way he describes it, open up his skull and pour his brain onto the page and follow all these deep feelings inside of him. And also some other ways that Ghibli worked are absolutely, you know, mad to when you speak to other filmmakers. Miyazaki would do all of the image boards, these watercolor paintings of characters and scenes and settings. Then he might start the storyboards, as you saw a couple that I had in the presentation. And then he'd deliver Act 1 to the animators, and they'd start animating before he'd even figured out what the ending of the film was. And so that's why I think there's such complexity, because sometimes he'd be making these films over the screenplay, for example, would be finished while the start of the film was being animated. So it's almost a process that you see. It's almost a live conversation between the filmmaker and the film and you, the audience. The Boy and the Heron is one of those, where there is if you look at the dates for the storyboards, the screenplay, there are big gaps of years between them. And it seems like he almost changes direction, because during the making of the film, lots of his mentors and colleagues died, and suddenly it becomes more about mortality and less about the war setting. He has lots going on in his brain, and so many of the filmmakers. There are some great studios and filmmakers that we've covered on the podcast and our books, but they don't have that freedom to be idiosyncratic in the same way.
So, hello, I'm Zuzka, I'm here.
Hi.
And I have one question. Did you analyze how it influenced other animator, if I can call it the Japanese animation industry, the Studio Ghibli, because I was there once. I could visit the National Museum, and there was also focus on Ghibli studio. I could visit also the Ponok studio, who also send several animation to our festivals. By the way, I'm a co-worker with Jaroslava, and we were very proud that Zlín Film Festival had animation here from Ponok studio. But I would say here in Europe, they don't talk so much about other studios that are influenced from Ghibli, because few animators left Ghibli and establish new studios, and I think that's amazing, but we don't know so much about it because it is so far, probably.
Well, I've been very lucky through my work as a film critic, but then also the podcast, that I've interviewed lots of animators over the years. And it's not just animators, it's musicians, video game designers, graphic novelists, and they love Ghibli. I think it's got to the stage now where, particularly in the UK, in the US as well, anyone graduating from art school probably has a no-face tattoo here on their bicep, or they're a Totoro or something. It's just, it's something that's in the culture. In terms of Ponok, that's a very unique circumstance because they were Ghibli veterans. That film, When Marnie Was There, that I mentioned, had the, well, first of all, it had the tough act to follow because The Wind Rises and Tale of the Princess Kaguya, which were both billed as the final films from Hayao Miyazaki and Isao Takahata, they came out, and then When Marnie Was There had to come out a few months later, made by youngsters, comparative youngsters, with no input from the old guard at the studio. And then literally, just as that film was released, they said, Ghibli's closed now, we're all retiring. So then they were left in the lurch, so to speak. And the producer, Yoshiaki Nishimura, who had really distinguished himself, he'd produced Princess Kaguya and When Marnie Was There, the director, Hiromasa Yonebayashi, they went down the road and set up their own studio. And they literally picked up, you might have heard this when they came to the festival, they took the actual animator's desk from Ghibli, packed it into a truck and took it to their own studio. And they wanted to create films in that tradition that could speak to general audiences, various audiences, draw inspiration from world culture and world literature, and they were very vocal about that. And then, of course, Miyazaki comes out of retirement, and most of Ponok then go and work on Boy and the Heron again. They were brought back into the fold, so it's an interesting full circle moment. But I found with Japanese filmmakers, it's almost not worth asking because, of course, these films have been on TV and in cinemas or video. Heidi, Anne of Green Gables, Future Boy Conan, you talk to anybody in their 50s now, they would have been watching that. That was their TV show they'd watch as kids. So even if it's not something they will say out loud, it's in the culture, it's in the water. So I've interviewed Mamoru Hosoda and Makoto Shinkai, who are two filmmakers who are seen as the next great auteurs of Japanese animation. Some of the first films they ever saw were Ghibli films. So it's almost too obvious to them that it's had an inspiration on them. But I hope that answers your question a little bit. I think
you answer very well, and if I can speak for audience, I want to say really, I really appreciate your presentation. It was one of the best what I heard here and this year, and I deeply appreciate it. So thank you very much.
Oh, thanks. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, hello. Thank you very much. Yeah, so my question is about the movie from 2020, Earwig and the Witch.
Earwig and the Witch, yes.
Yeah, the 3D animated one. Yeah, and I think my question would be like, it was the first and for now last 3D animated movie, and I don't know if it was very famous or like you know, popular, because I haven't seen it, and I'm not really planning to be honest. I watched the trailers and I didn't like it at all, but maybe I will after I watch it. Yeah, but my question would be if you have seen it, and what do you think about it? What do you think about Studio Ghibli, you know, going in that direction? And they obviously returned to the animation in Boy and Heron, so what do you think about it? And did you like it?
Well, first of all, has anyone here seen Earwig and the Witch from 2020? Oh, so Yaroslava has. This is fascinating. So I've done screenings or these talks or whatever in the UK with really hardcore Ghibli fans. And I ask that question and we get maybe one hand up. So this is the forgotten Ghibli movie. It didn't help that it came out in 2020. It was supposed to have a world premiere in Cannes in May 2020. And that festival didn't happen that year because of COVID. And it's not great, I'm afraid. It doesn't help that it's adapting a novel by Diana Wynne Jones, which was published posthumously. So she's the author that wrote Howl's Moving Castle, and one of the great writers of fantasy in the English language canon. But she didn't finish it. It's like 120 pages. There's hardly anything there. And the CG aspect, it's got an uncanny valley aspect because the characters are still designed by Katsuya Kondo, who is one of the great character designers of Ghibli. So there's something about it, but it doesn't look right. And for British people watching it, it's set in the UK. And I didn't talk about it much in this presentation, but another theme you could do about Ghibli is food in Ghibli, and how their focus and their attention to detail on making these wonderful things, even simple things like fried egg and bacon in Howl's Moving Castle looks so delicious. Earwig and the Witch has shepherd's pie. It's meant to be set in sort of the Lake District in northern England. And you could tell they'd had photo reference, but it just wasn't right. It was like shepherd's pie with some peas on the side and a pasty, and it's all wrong. But I feel it's probably the worst Ghibli film, really, and it's probably best forgotten. Ronya the Robber's Daughter, which I mentioned, is another CG project, but that was an interesting one. The characters are CG animated, but with a cel-shaded style, where they paint over the rigged 3D models, and the backgrounds are painted still. And I think that's a better manifestation of them embracing CG more. But I feel bad because Goro Miyazaki, who I didn't mention much in the presentation, he is Hayao Miyazaki's son. And he didn't go into animation. He studied to become a landscape architect, a designer of public parks and spaces. And he was brought into the Ghibli story to design and project manage the build of the Ghibli Museum in the late 1990s. And Toshio Suzuki, the way that he tells the story, this guy I call the Machiavellian ringmaster, he said that Goro did such a good job building the museum, he would make a good job directing a film, which sounds like a big leap. And he ended up being assigned making this film, Tales from Earthsea, which among fans is seen as maybe the worst Ghibli film, although I think Earwig and the Witch has taken that crown. So unfortunately, Goro Miyazaki has made two of the worst Ghibli films. He did make a film called From Up on Poppy Hill, which I think that is screening here in the festival, which I think is great. I think it's really good. But I interviewed Goro Miyazaki, and he's talked very plainly about how he put it in a blog for his website. I would give Hayao Miyazaki full marks as a filmmaker, 0 marks as a father, which is another strand we could have put in this presentation. Miyazaki is almost the world's dad or the world's uncle because he has all these very avuncular themes in his films. But he was a terrible real dad. He worked 6 days a week, would mostly sleep under his desk or come back bleary-eyed at 2 a.m. Sunday, he would just sleep. So Goro Miyazaki barely saw his dad throughout his childhood and had to find Hayao Miyazaki, as all of us have, through his films. So when I interviewed Goro Miyazaki about Earwig and the Witch, I asked him, because it was during lockdown, I asked him how he balances family and filmmaking, knowing what he knows about how much filmmaking can take a father away from his family. And he says he always goes home for dinner with his kids at night. So I think he's a good guy. So I always feel bad when I criticize his films. So maybe watch it. Maybe you'll like it. I'd love to know what you make of it. But it's not so bad that it's been forgotten.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hello. Yeah, this is better.
Hi.
Hi. I wanted to ask because very, very soon I'm going to be writing my bachelor's thesis about Studio Ghibli.
Cool.
And, well, I'm going to be pouring my heart passionately out, mostly about Howl's Moving Castle, because it's very close to my heart. Well, I will also try to sound the most academic as I can. I wanted to ask, what advice would you give someone in my position who's about to write something like this? And yeah, I just wanted to know. Thank you.
Don't leave it to the night before your deadline.
Yeah.
Plan things out properly.
Yeah.
I think with Ghibli, and this is something I would recommend for everybody writing about Ghibli or appreciating Ghibli, try and get as many Japanese sources as you can, or direct sources. So those books I mentioned. Howl's Moving Castle has an art book where you can look at the concept art and quotes from the animators themselves. The book, I think it would be Turning Point, would have Miyazaki's directorial memoranda and other interviews around that time, because that's a film that played at the Venice Film Festival, so there are interviews and press conferences about Howl's Moving Castle. The reason why I say that is because in the West, particularly in the English-speaking world, there are so many myths and false stories about Miyazaki, and we project so much onto him as a person that I always recommend, wherever you can, try and trace it all the way back to something he actually said, or something that's in the film. Try and analyze the film, because I've got a list somewhere of all of these false things that go around. There's one in particular, I don't know if any of you have seen it. Every 6 months or so, it comes up on Reddit or Instagram or Facebook or Twitter again about the Blu-ray case for Totoro in Japan, and how they've got this picture where the inside of, if you open the Blu-ray case, the inside of the sleeve has Mei and Satsuki looking down, and you put the DVD in upside down, it looks like they're looking into a little pond. No, that's not what Ghibli did at all. You can look on Amazon and see what the discs actually look like, but that gets shared by thousands and thousands of users because people want to buy into that lie. They love the idea that Ghibli has an idea for everything. But so that'd be my recommendation. I hope it's a good one. But maybe if you want to have a chat afterwards, we can talk more about your specific kind of angle.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Does anyone want this?
Hello.
Hi, mate.
I would like to know your opinion on how important is, I don't want to mispronounce the name, Gyo Hisaishi's music for Studio Ghibli's films.
I mean, he's amazing. I've met a few people here who were their first Ghibli film ever was Princess Mononoke the other night, and they were musicians, and I said, you've got to listen to the music, it's fantastic. I think his music, I mean, it's like there are very few collaborations. I mean, I guess it would be Bernard Herrmann and Alfred Hitchcock, or Spielberg and John Williams, where they just seem to be completely in sync. And Miyazaki doesn't give Joe Hisaishi much guidance. Sometimes he will write little poems that he shares with him about characters, but he trusts Hisaishi to make his music. And there's a whole, whether it's a podcast or a book or a documentary series you could make about how Joe Hisaishi has grown and changed over the 40 years working with Miyazaki's films. He was like an electronic jazz musician in the early 1980s. He was making stuff that was like Yellow Magic Orchestra or Ryuichi Sakamoto's music. And then he became this lush orchestral composer. When I say important, I'm not a musicologist. I can't really analyze his music too deeply. However, in terms of impact and in terms of fan appreciation, Joe is indispensable, because in a time where Ghibli became more and more secretive, Miyazaki became, I mean, he never was one to go to conventions or anything. Joe traveled around the world playing orchestral concerts. He was in Vienna. I've been telling people here because I flew into Vienna, so that's probably how close here he was. But in London, he played 2 nights at Wembley Arena, and going and being with tens of thousands of people listening to the scores of these films. And he is there giving us all an opportunity to enjoy these films together and pour our emotion and gratitude onto one person, because Miyazaki is never going to be that guy. So I think that's how important he is as an ambassador for the film as well, and giving us that emotional outlet. I hope that answered your question. We have 10 minutes maybe, if anyone has any questions, or that's a good point to wrap up. Oh, okay, let's keep going.
Hi.
Hi.
You might have talked about it, but I still can't wrap my head around the fact how Miyazaki is able to make those movies and the scenes like dreamy, but he is still quite grumpy guy. Like what I saw from, I haven't seen the documentary about him, but I saw parts because I was at work, so I missed it.
He is the world's grumpiest man,
yeah.
But he does still have that inner child. I'd recommend trying to track down any of the documentaries about him, but The Kingdom of Dreams and Madness is the best one, I think, in terms of how it's made. But just any of these documentaries show him in his element, where he's smoking and drinking coffee and saying the world is destroying, doing whatever, the world's going to pot. But then he'll have a little joke with his assistant or with the other people in the office, or he'll give, handing out all sweets to all the kids who come round to wish him happy birthday. And I think what I love about him as a filmmaker is that all of those contradictions are on his sleeve. He is the grumpiest man in the world who is also the biggest kid in the world. He is a pacifist who will gladly spend all his spare time drawing tanks and planes. All these things are coexisting in one person, and that's why I feel like watching his films is this active dialogue, because he is human. And that's something that he said all the way back in the late 80s when late 80s, early 90s, when computers were starting to be used for animation. He said he really wants to retain the sense that humans made this work. It's got the imperfections, it's not perfect. And that shows as well in the filmmakers that he admires. He loves Aardman from the UK because you can literally see the fingerprints, although I think they smooth them out a little bit now. But like, you watch classic Aardman, you can see the little fingerprints on the models because they're being manipulated by hand. So my answer to you was quite long and wayward there, but I think he's able to hold two extremes in one person.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
Are you planning more books about Studio Ghibli in the future or next year? Or
You joke, but we have written like 6 books in 5 years, which is like we've been writing constantly, so it's just, oh yeah, we should probably stop and give ourselves a break. What would we write about? Because Ghibliotheque is the history and a review of every film, and we did an updated edition with The Boy and the Heron. Ghibliverse, maybe we could expand that. Ghibliverse was the works they made before they founded Ghibli, the Ghibli in real life, like the stage shows or the museum and the park. I mean, I can talk about Ghibli forever, so maybe there is another book in us, but we'll have to see. The new book that we've just finished writing that is coming out in October is our most ambitious one, another one that I never thought our publisher would let us do, which is called the Animation Atlas. Which is a great title I came up with years ago. It's not quite an atlas, it's more in line with the books we've written so far, but where our books would be, for example, the Anime Movie Guide was 30 chapters with 1 film per chapter to try and explain or make sense of the Japanese animation industry. The Animation Atlas is 30 chapters where we have a different country in each chapter showing the wonderful world of animation. And that was quite exciting because even some of my colleagues have published books or listicles online where they try to say the 30 greatest animated films from around the world, and then you break it down and it's 15 from America and 10 from Japan, and then it's France and the UK. When you challenge yourself to actually say, no, okay, 1 chapter is France, 1 chapter is Japan, what are the other 28 chapters going to be? Because when we've written these books, we know that our books are introductory beginner's guides. If you want to get a really deep appreciation, there's like academic work and people who are professors. So of course there are amazing books about African animation or Chinese animation or Czech animation. But we're able to have a little chapter where we can say, go and seek out the films of Jan Schwankmeyer or Jiří Trinka and people like that. Because we want to get people excited to go out and watch more films. So no Ghibli for now, but the Animation Atlas is out in October. Thanks. I think there's somebody over there as well.
Hi.
Hi.
I wanted to ask for some advice on writing, since I think I found a passion for writing, and I want to ask you if you have some writing tips that I could use.
Okay, wow. Well, I'm always encouraged by a deadline. And I make it depends what you're doing. If do you know what you're writing, or do you mean more generally? Do you have a project in mind?
No, it's not about school. It's just I want to write something by myself, basically, or with my own characters and story.
Oh, so creative writing. Oh, right, okay. I have no artistic bone in my body. I'm not the person to ask about how to write something fictional, because I hide behind other people's works and hide behind enthusiasm. But really, not to sound like Hayao Miyazaki in Whisper of the Heart, but I really do think just try and try and try, get it out. and then edit afterwards, or put it away in a drawer and start again. For me, with writing film reviews and film criticism, I finished university and I moved to London, and I just wrote reviews of every film I saw, of every book I read, whether that was on a blog or in a diary, and through that helped me order my thoughts and also figure out what my voice was. And what's different, I suppose, for creative writing, for writing journalism or criticism or the books, it's always writing plainly and knowing who your audience is and how to talk to them, communicate with them, rather than showing off, which I think a lot of people maybe get caught up in, like their turns of phrase and their flowery phrases. But good luck with it. I'm sorry, I can't give you more concrete advice about writing scripts and stories. But one thing I would say, read. Read everything you can. Draw as much inspiration as you can. Hayao Miyazaki apparently hasn't watched a film in 30 years, and he only reads children's books. And what's amazing is, in the UK, we have a really great tradition of writing for kids. However, the establishment in the UK is terrible at talking about some of our great writers. And for me, I've only discovered them through Ghibli films and through Miyazaki, the sorts of works he talks about. And it's the same with all the great works of European literature that Ghibli admires. So I think that's something as well, watching films, seeing who they talk about, and who they admire, and just broaden your horizons that way and bring it all back into your own work. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
So my next question would be maybe, what do you think is the most underrated film from the Ghibli studios? Because for me it's the Tales of Princess Kaguya.
Yes.
Which is a movie I watched. I remember when I was in middle school, I watched all of the movies, and it was the last one, and I was like, no, I don't want to watch that. I was just not invested in that animation, and I'm so sad that I didn't watch it like earlier, because it's such a powerful and amazing movie with amazing story. I cried so much during the movie. Yeah. It's so beautiful. So what is your what do you think is the most underrated film?
I've talked about it so much tonight, but it's Whisper of the Heart, absolutely. And I don't think I need to talk about it anymore, because you've all heard me wang on about it. Princess Kaguya is fantastic, and that is an absolute miracle of animation, what they had to do. And it was, at the time, the most expensive Japanese film ever made, because they had to take so much time and create this one-off production process to capture that deceptively simple thing, which is they wanted to make it seem like the artist's pen come to life before your very eyes, like it was an ink and watercolor scroll being animated before your eyes. And they discovered quite quickly that the traditional Japanese process of key animators and in-between animators and then scanning and then ink and painting doesn't really work the same for that. So that's a whole story in its own right. I find it quite hard to judge what underrated is with Ghibli, because every film has its hardcore fans, and after a certain point they all had a certain level of acclaim and interest. So Tale of the Princess Kaguya was nominated for an Oscar, I suppose, so like that probably pushed it up a little bit up the ranks. But I always point to Whisper of the Heart. I love Porco Rosso. I think that's a really interesting film, and related to what we said earlier about how Miyazaki had this freedom. He originally started it out as a short film that was meant to be played as an in-flight entertainment on flights. So it was meant to just be some dumb action for sleepy, slightly drunk businessmen. And then partway through production, it was when there were all sorts of world conflicts going on, and he just developed a real political conscience for the times, and he wanted it to be about, as it is, a pilot who flew in a war, reckoning with his culpability within those actions. And it becomes this sort of weird mixture of like flying ace adventure and also commentary on the horrors of living through war. So that's another one I'd recommend picking up. But really, out of 25 films, 20 of them are great. So I'd recommend really picking any of them out of the list and watching them. Because also When Marnie Was There, I think, is also a gem. I could go on and on and on, though.
Thank you.
This might have to be the last question, right? We need to be out by 8 o'clock.
Yes, the last question. Peter.
Hi, I'm Peter.
Hi.
I have a question to your yesterday's presentation before the Princess Mononoke screening. You told a nice story about the producer Suzuki in Miramax studio with the sword.
Yes.
But you didn't explain a small detail. Was it meant as a warning or just a present from him?
Both, I suppose. So if you haven't heard this story, I think some of you might have done. Princess Mononoke was sort of like Porco Rosso, was born out of this political conscience that Miyazaki had, and he wanted to present the sort of horrors of the world and this destroyed, devastated, sinful world that we have to find beautiful things within. And however, at the same time as he was making this film, Ghibli were getting Disney on board to be their distributor in Japan, but also potentially around the world or in the United States. And they said, we want the next Miyazaki movie. And is it going to be like My Neighbour Totoro and Kiki's Delivery Service? Is it going to be a kids' movie? And they said, well, it's called Princess Mononoke, and it's got a boy character and a girl character, and they did something really funny where they cut together a trailer for Disney where it made it look like these two characters kiss at one point. Then when you watch the film, it's actually Ashitaka has passed out in battle, and San is masticating some food to spit into his mouth to nurse him back to health. But they cut just before that part in the trailer. But then when Disney found out that it's actually a very violent film where a character has his arm chopped off in one part and a head chopped off in another, they gave it to Miramax. And what I didn't say in that intro was that the person at Miramax was Harvey Weinstein, of course, who's now completely persona non grata, but at that point in time was very powerful, and he'd buy world cinema, chop it up into ribbons, redub it into English with a view to pleasing the bottom line in America. And he didn't know that Ghibli had negotiated in their contract a no-cuts clause. They had to be released uncut in American cinemas because they'd been burned many years previously. Nausicaa, the Vow of the Wind had been recut into a film called Warriors of the Wind, where they cut out, I think, like 45 minutes of the film, and the poster makes it look like Star Wars or Dune or something, and Miyazaki had hated that experience. But yes, so Toshio Suzuki, when he went to visit Weinstein at Miramax, had a suitcase or a little case and hadn't said anything in English all day, and they got to the boardroom, and then he went to the head of the boardroom table and opened up the case, and there was a samurai sword inside, and he said, Harvey Weinstein, Miramax, Princess Mononoke, no cuts. And so it was, I guess it's passive aggressive, right? That's the term. It's a gift, but it's also a, hey, read that contract, read the finer details. And I think it's a great power play. It meant that Princess Mononoke was able to be released in English-speaking countries, completely uncut and true to Miyazaki's vision. It did mean, though, that it had a very limited platform release, as they call it, in the States, where it wasn't a big hit. It was a huge hit in Japan, but an art house hit in America, and it wasn't until a few years later with Spirited Away that they really broke through. But that's just one of many stories that Toshio Suzuki likes to spin, and I think I've shared enough stories with you tonight. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming along.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
A ještě bychom rádi udělali s vámi fotografii. As in the cinema, we will make a picture together with the audience.
Okay. Am I doing this? Okay, yes. Okay, don't fall off the edge.